In the summer of 2008, a team of researchers in Leipzig, Germany received a package from Siberia. Inside was a fragment of bone, a piece of a child's pinky finger, pulled from the sediment of a cave called Denisova in the Altai Mountains. Small enough to sit in the center of your palm, unremarkable to look at. The kind of thing that could have been bagged, labeled, and filed away without anyone losing sleep over it. Then the DNA came back. The sequence did not match Homo sapiens. It did not match Neanderthals. It did not match anything in any database of human genetic material that existed at the time. The researchers ran it again. Same result. What they were looking at was a species of human being that science had never encountered before. Identified not from a skull or a skeleton, but from a piece of a child's smallest finger. That discovery did not just add one entry to a list. It revealed something about every entry we were missing. The cave that fingerbone came from had been studied for decades. A well-mapped site in a well-explored mountain range. And even there, a completely unknown human species was waiting in the sediment. Think about every cave that has never been excavated, every valley where no archaeologist has ever worked, every island where bones dissolved in tropical soil before anyone thought to look. Here is what that fingerbone was really telling us. For almost all of human history, we were not alone on this planet. There were others, different in ways that mattered, similar in ways that mattered more. And around 40,000 years ago, the last of them disappeared. What happened in that long stretch between the first human footprint on this planet and the moment we became the only ones left is what this story is about. There is an image you have seen so many times, it has stopped feeling like an argument and started feeling like a fact. A row of figures moving left to right. The leftmost one is hunched, knuckles close to the ground. Each figure to the right stands a little straighter, a little taller, a little more recognizably human. The final figure on the far right stands fully upright, shoulders back, chin level with the horizon. Finished. Complete. The March of Progress. Published in 1965 in a Time Life book on early man, it has appeared on T-shirts and coffee mugs and classroom walls across the United States for 60 years. It is wrong in almost every meaningful way. The image encodes an assumption about how evolution works that biologists rejected decades ago. And that assumption has continued to shape how most people think about human origins long after the science moved on without them. The assumption is that evolution is a ladder, that life moves in a single directed line from primitive to advanced, from lesser to greater, that every living species is the current top rung of its own ladder, and every extinct species was simply a step on the way to something better. Evolution is not a ladder. It is a bush, a dense, tangled, constantly branching bush, with thousands of tips reaching in every direction at once, most of them ending in dead branches, a few continuing to grow, and no single branch that can claim to be more finished or more correct than any other. When a population becomes separated from the rest of its species, by a mountain range or a rising sea level, or simply by wandering far enough that the two groups stop meeting each other, the two populations begin to change independently. Over enough time, they become different enough that they can no longer interbreed successfully. At that point, they are different species. Neither one is better. Neither one is more evolved. They are two different experiments that started from the same raw material. This happened with humans many times, across millions of years, on multiple continents, producing multiple populations of human beings that were simultaneously related to each other and distinct from each other in ways that our usual categories struggle to contain. the word species itself becomes slippery when applied to human evolution, and that is worth pausing on before going any further. In most contexts, a species is defined as a group of organisms that can interbreed with each other, but not with members of other groups. This definition is clean and useful in many situations. It is considerably less clean when applied to the human family, because the evidence from ancient DNA now tells us that the different groups we call distinct species were interbreeding with each other on a regular basis for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had children together. The evidence is in the genomes of living humans today. Homo sapiens and Denisovans had children together. The evidence is in the genomes of people in Papua New Guinea and the Philippines and Aboriginal Australia, where Denisovan ancestry runs at levels indicating sustained contact. Not a single accidental encounter. There is evidence of Neanderthals and Denisovans interbreeding with each other as well. And there are signals in the human genome pointing to mixing events with archaic populations we have not yet identified. Groups that have no name because we have not found their bones. So, when this story uses the word species, it uses it the way scientists use it when they are being honest about its limitations. A label of convenience. A way of marking groups that were different enough to be worth distinguishing, while acknowledging that the boundaries between those groups were permeable in ways the label does not capture. With that said, here is what the evidence currently suggests about the shape of the human bush during the period when it was most densely branched. Roughly 50,000 years ago, Earth was home to at least several distinct groups of humans. Homo sapiens had spread from Africa into Asia and were pushing into Europe. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for at least 200,000 years. Denisovans occupied a vast and still poorly understood range across Asia, on the island of Flores in what is now Indonesia. A small-bodied human called Homo floresiensis had been living in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. On the island of Luzon in the Philippines, another distinct human group had been there long enough to evolve characteristics found nowhere else. In Africa, Homo naledi coexisted with early Homo sapiens in ways we are only beginning to understand. And in various parts of Asia, there were populations of archaic humans whose relationship to the named groups remains a subject of active and unresolved scientific debate. 9 is a number that appears in the title of this story, and it deserves a direct comment. 9 is not a number that any scientist would defend as definitive. The count of distinct human species that coexisted at any given point depends on how you define species, which fossils you include, what time window you are looking at, and where the current state of research happens to have left the question of classification for each group. Some researchers would count more, some would count fewer. The honest answer is that we do not know exactly how many, and we probably never will. What 9 represents, used honestly, is a lower bound on the diversity of human life during a period when that diversity was near its peak. At least that many. Depending on how you draw the lines. Possibly more. And that is the number that matters for the central question of this story. If there were at least 9 distinct kinds of human beings on this planet, all of them tool-using, all of them socially complex, all of them adapted to specific environments in ways refined over hundreds of thousands of years, what happened to 8 of them? The easy answer is that we replaced them. Homo sapiens arrived, and the others disappeared. And the connection between those two facts is straightforward. The easy answer is wrong. The real answer is longer and stranger and more uncomfortable. But before we get to the ending of the other humans, we need to understand who they were, not as entries in a taxonomy, as people. The story of how the human world became a world of one does not start with the disappearance of the others. It starts almost 2 million years ago, with the first human being who ever looked at the horizon and decided to find out what was on the other side. Put yourself on the shore of a lake in what is now northern Kenya. 1.8 million years ago. The air is warm and smells like grass and water. Acacia trees line the far bank. The sky above you is the same sky that exists above your head right now. The same stars in the same positions. The same sun, tracking the same arc from east to west. But the world around you is not your world in any way that would feel familiar. The only evidence that anything with a human mind has ever been here is a scatter of stone flakes on the ground near the water. Sharp fragments of dark volcanic rock that catch the light at an angle that says intention. That says a mind was here. That says something was trying to solve a problem. The creature that made those tools is standing about 30 meters away, fully upright, legs long in proportion to the body, built for covering ground efficiently, built for the kind of sustained walking that can carry a body across 10 or 15 miles of open savanna in a day. Its hands are free. Its face is flatter than a chimpanzee's. Its brain is larger than any of its predecessors, though smaller than yours. Its name, the name scientists would give it almost 2 million years later, is Homo erectus. And it is about to do something that no creature in the history of life on Earth had ever done before. It is going to leave. Homo erectus walked out of Africa before any other member of the human family had even evolved. They reached what is now the country of Georgia by 1.8 million years ago. They reached Java in what is now Indonesia by 1.6 million years ago. They spread across South and East Asia, establishing populations across a range that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Africa to within a few hundred miles of the Pacific Ocean. They did all of this without boats, without maps, without any technology more sophisticated than stone tools and, eventually, fire. They did it by walking, generation by generation, following game and water and the slow geographic logic of a species finding the edges of what its range could be. And they survived in that range for an almost incomprehensible span of time. The numbers here are worth sitting with, because the human mind is not built to hold them properly. Homo sapiens has existed in its current anatomical form for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years. Modern human civilization, from the first cities in Mesopotamia to the satellites currently orbiting above your head, is roughly 10,000 years old. Everything that has ever been written down, every name we know, every war we can date, every building we can point to and say a specific person ordered it built, fits inside 10,000 years. Homo erectus existed for close to 2 million years. 2 million years is 200 times the age of human civilization. If you compressed the existence of Homo erectus into a single calendar year, the entire span of human civilization would occupy the last 11 hours of December 31st. This is the creature we tend to treat as a footnote, a precursor, a stepping stone on the ladder to us. That framing is not just scientifically wrong. It is a failure of imagination so complete that it prevents us from understanding what Homo erectus actually was. What they actually were was a successful, adaptable, geographically widespread species of human being that occupied this planet for longer than any other member of the genus Homo has managed before or since. They made tools. They used fire. The hearths associated with Homo erectus sites push the use of controlled fire back to at least 400,000 years ago. And some researchers argue for evidence considerably older. Fire is not a trivial technology. It changes the nutrition available from food by making cooked calories accessible in ways that raw food does not allow. It extends the usable hours of a day. It changes the relationship between a small group of vulnerable animals and the darkness and the cold, and the predators that operate in both. And they were social in a way that the bones make clear. Homo erectus skeletons show healed injuries that would have been incapacitating during recovery. Injuries from which an individual could not have survived without being cared for. Someone kept them alive long enough to heal. This is not sentimentality projected onto ancient bones. It is the straightforward implication of what the physical record shows. They were, in other words, doing something that looks like culture. Not culture in the sense of art or religion. Culture in the simpler and more fundamental sense of learned behavior transmitted between individuals across generations. The capacity to take information about how to survive in a specific environment and pass it on so the next generation does not start from scratch. That capacity is probably the deepest thread connecting Homo erectus to every other member of the human family that came after them, including us. Now here is the part of the Homo erectus story that most accounts skip past too quickly, because it complicates the narrative of human progress in ways that are difficult to resolve cleanly. When Homo sapiens began leaving Africa, roughly 70,000 years ago, some populations of Homo erectus, or their direct descendants, were still alive. On the island of Java, the last Homo erectus populations may have survived until as recently as 117,000 years ago. In parts of East Asia, archaic human populations with clear Homo erectus ancestry were still present when the first Homo sapiens began arriving. The first great wanderer of the human family did not simply vanish before the story of Homo sapiens began. The two stories overlapped, and that overlap matters for the question at the center of this story. Because Homo erectus was not the last group of humans to disappear in the presence of Homo sapiens. It was only the first. There is a skeleton that was found in France in 1908, in a cave called La Chapelle aux Saints, that changed, and then unchanged, and then changed again, the way the entire world thought about who the Neanderthals were. The individual was elderly by Neanderthal standards, probably in his late 30s or 40s. He had severe arthritis throughout his spine and joints. He had lost most of his teeth, which in a culture dependent on chewing tough meat and raw plant material would have made independent nutrition extremely difficult. He had healed injuries from earlier in his life. Injuries serious enough that recovery would have taken weeks. He survived anyway, for years, in a condition that made self-sufficiency nearly impossible. Other members of his group kept him alive, fed him, stayed with him through the slow deterioration of a body that could no longer do what it once could. For decades after the discovery, this skeleton was used as the primary model for reconstructions of Neanderthals as stooped, shuffling, mentally limited creatures. The reconstruction was based on a misreading of the skeleton that failed to account for how severely his arthritis had distorted his posture. When the skeleton was reanalyzed, the picture changed entirely. He was not a primitive brute. He was an elderly man with severe arthritis whose community refused to abandon him. The image of the brutish caveman was built, in part, on the bones of a sick old man whose people took care of him until he died. Hold that for a moment before moving on to anything else about the Neanderthals. Because that detail, that a group of people in Ice Age Europe, 200,000 years before the first human city was built, looked at one of their own, who could no longer contribute to the group's survival and chose to keep him alive anyway, is not a minor footnote. It is the thing this chapter is actually about. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia for somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 years, depending on how you count their precursor populations. They lived there through multiple cycles of glaciation, through periods when ice sheets covered northern Europe, down to latitudes roughly equivalent to modern London and Berlin, when the landscapes they occupied were open-steppe tundra, cold and wind-scoured, more similar to modern Siberia than to the rolling green hills of contemporary Europe. The bones tell you what that life required. The femur of a Neanderthal has a shaft diameter that would be remarkable in any modern human athlete. The muscle attachment points on the skeleton are pronounced in a way that indicates muscle mass well beyond what any modern human population regularly achieves. Studies of Neanderthal bone trauma patterns show a distribution of healed fractures remarkably similar to that found in modern rodeo riders. High rates of injury to the head, neck, and upper body. Injuries consistent with close-quarters encounters with large, dangerous animals. Injuries that healed, which means someone else was there during recovery. The old man of La Chapelle aux Saints was not unusual in this regard. Across the full geographic range of Neanderthal occupation, the pattern repeats. Individuals who should have died from their injuries and did not because other members of the group were providing what those individuals could no longer provide for themselves. This is a people who took care of each other. The evidence is in the bones, not in any romantic interpretation of the past. The Neanderthal brain was large, not slightly larger than Homo sapiens on average, equal to or exceeding it, depending on which samples you compare. The argument that Neanderthals were cognitively limited purely on the basis of brain size does not hold up, because the brains were not smaller. What they were was differently shaped. The Neanderthal brain was proportionally larger toward the back, in regions associated with visual processing. The Homo sapiens brain is proportionally larger in the frontal and temporal regions, areas associated with complex social cognition and abstract planning. These differences may reflect real differences in cognitive style rather than simply cognitive capacity. Their tools were sophisticated. The Mousterian stone tool industry, named after a site in France where it was first systematically described, required advanced planning and a mental template of the finished product held in mind throughout the production process. They hafted those tools, attaching stone points to wooden handles using adhesives made from birch bark tar, a substance requiring a controlled heating process that implies an understanding of material transformation that goes beyond simple stone-on-stone work. They cooked food. They used plants, likely for medicinal purposes. They decorated themselves. Eagle talons from a site in Croatia, associated with Neanderthals and dated to more than 130,000 years ago. Show cut marks and polish consistent with personal ornament, perforated shells with traces of pigment, found at sites in Spain, date to a period before modern humans arrived in Europe. Feathers from birds of prey appear in association with Neanderthal remains at multiple sites, in quantities and contexts, suggesting decoration rather than insulation. They buried their dead. The evidence for this remains debated in certain specific cases, and that debate is appropriate and real. But across the full range of sites where Neanderthal remains appear in apparent burial contexts, at La Ferracie in France, at Kabara Cave in Israel, at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, the pattern is difficult to explain entirely without some concept of intentional treatment of the dead, whether they had any belief about what death meant, whether they had anything resembling the ideas about mortality that human cultures have developed everywhere in the world, is something the bones cannot answer. But that they treated their dead as something other than refuse is, on the balance of the current evidence, Likely, these are the ice people, a successful, cognitively capable, socially complex species of human being that occupied Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, that survived multiple glaciations that would have ended most species that tried to live through them, that developed technologies and social behaviors sophisticated enough to sustain populations across a landscape that offered extraordinary challenges and comparatively few easy solutions. They were here long before we were. When Homo sapiens first began pushing into the territories that Neanderthals had held for 200,000 years, the newcomers were entering a world that someone else had already figured out. The hunting routes, the water sources, the cave systems that offered shelter from the cold, the seasonal movements of prey animals across a landscape shaped by ice. All of this was knowledge that Neanderthals had spent 200,000 years accumulating. The Neanderthals did not disappear because the world had outgrown them. They disappeared after we arrived. What their world looked like in those final years. What passed between them and the newcomers expanding from the east. And what exactly it means that some part of them is still present in the bodies of the people who replaced them, is a question this story will return to. But to understand the full weight of that question, we need to first understand the shape of the world they were part of. A world where Neanderthals were only one of several human experiments running simultaneously, across a planet large enough to hold all of them. We need to go east. We need to find the ghost. There is a specific kind of scientific discovery that does not announce itself with drama. No earthquake, no flash of light, no moment where someone stands up from a laboratory bench and says the words that change everything. Just a researcher staring at a computer screen in Leipzig, Germany, watching a software program compare genetic sequences, and slowly realizing that the numbers on the screen do not match any number they have seen before. That is how the Denisovans were found. Not in a field, not at an excavation, in a genetics laboratory. In 2010, when a team led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology finished sequencing the DNA from that finger bone pulled out of Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. The cave sat at an elevation of roughly 700 meters in a river valley that had been occupied by various human groups for at least 280,000 years. Archaeologists had been working the site since the 1980s. They had found Neanderthal remains. They had found early modern human remains. They had found stone tools and bone fragments, and the ordinary residue of a cave used as shelter across deep time. The finger bone looked ordinary. The DNA inside it was not. When the sequence came back, it showed a pattern of genetic divergence that placed this individual outside both the Homo sapiens lineage and the Neanderthal lineage. Not slightly outside, substantially outside, in a way that indicated the population this child belonged to had been separated from the Neanderthal lineage for somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 years, accumulating genetic differences across that entire span of separation. This was not a variant of a known group. This was a group that science had never encountered before, identified for the first time, not from a skull or a skeleton, but from the DNA of a child's finger bone, small enough to hold between two fingers. They were named Denisovans, after the cave where the first evidence of them was found. And from the beginning, everything about them was strange, in the way that things we cannot fully see are always strange. The physical record of the Denisovans is extraordinarily sparse. A finger bone, a few teeth, a fragment of a lower jaw found in a very different location, a partial skull fragment. That is nearly all we have from a group of humans that the genetic evidence tells us occupied a vast range across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. with Neanderthals. We have hundreds of skeletal remains from sites across Europe and Western Asia. We can reconstruct their faces. We can measure the capacity of their skulls. We can trace the geography of their range through the physical evidence they left behind. With Denisovans, we have DNA and almost nothing else but DNA. It turns out, I can tell you an enormous amount if you know how to read it. The genome sequenced from the Denisova finger bone was, for ancient DNA, remarkably well preserved. Cold temperatures slow the degradation of genetic material, and the Altai Mountains provided exactly the kind of environment where DNA from a 100,000-year-old bone could survive in readable condition. The quality of the sequence was good enough that researchers could not only confirm the existence of a new group, but begin to map its relationship to other human populations with considerable precision. What the genome showed was this. Denisovans split from the lineage leading to Neanderthals somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago. They were more closely related to Neanderthals than to Homo sapiens, but distinct enough that the separation between the two groups was real and substantial. At some point after that split, Denisovans and Neanderthals came back into contact and had children together. Because Neanderthal DNA appears in the Denisovan genome at levels consistent with interbreeding, and at some later point, Denisovans and Homo sapiens came into contact and had children together as well. Because Denisovan DNA appears in the genomes of living people today. People of European descent carry essentially no detectable Denisovan ancestry. People of East Asian descent carry a small amount, roughly 0.2%. But people of Melanesian descent, from Papua New Guinea and surrounding islands, carry somewhere between 4 and 6% Denisovan ancestry. Aboriginal Australians carry similar levels. People from the Philippines, particularly from groups that have lived in the islands for a very long time, carry Denisovan ancestry at levels that in some populations exceed 5%. This geographic pattern tells a story. The high levels of Denisovan ancestry in populations from island Southeast Asia and Melanesia and Australia mean that the interbreeding between Denisovans and the ancestors of those populations happened in that region. Homo sapiens moving through Southeast Asia, on their way to what would become Australia and Melanesia, encountered Denisovan populations that were living in that part of the world, and the two groups mixed extensively enough to leave a lasting genetic signal in every living descendant of those migrations. Denisovans were not confined to a single cave in Siberia. They were across Asia, from the cold highlands where the Denisova cave sits to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, occupying a geographic range that may have exceeded that of any other archaic human group. A range so large and so varied that the populations living at its different ends must have been adapted to environments with almost nothing in common. The evidence for Denisovans in high-altitude environments is particularly striking. A lower jawbone found in Siae, on the Tibetan Plateau in China, was identified in 2019 as Denisovan through ancient protein analysis. The protein analysis was necessary because the bone was too old and the conditions too dry for conventional DNA extraction. But the proteins in the bone carried a molecular signature that matched the Denisovan proteins from the Altai cave specimens. A Denisovan was living at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters on the Tibetan Plateau. This matters because surviving at that altitude requires a specific physiological adaptation. A variant of a gene called EPAS, one that regulates the body's response to low oxygen conditions. Modern Tibetans carry this variant, and it allows them to function at altitudes that would cause serious physiological problems for most other human populations. The variant in modern Tibetans traces back to Denisovan ancestry. Tibetans can live on the roof of the world because their ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, had children with Denisovans who had already spent enough generations at altitude to evolve the necessary biology. A fragment of jaw found near the Penghu Islands off the coast of Taiwan adds another layer to the geographic picture. That specimen, recovered from seafloor sediments, may represent a Denisovan population living in coastal Southeast Asia, in territory that today sits under the South China Sea. During glacial periods, when sea levels dropped dramatically, the shallow seabed between mainland Asia, Taiwan, and the larger islands of the Philippine archipelago was dry land, a broad coastal plain where populations could move and mix in ways that the current geography makes impossible. The Denisovans were there, on that plain, in that world that now exists only underwater. And then they were not there anymore. The reasons for their disappearance are even less clear than the reasons for the disappearance of the Neanderthals, because we have so much less physical evidence to work with. What we can say is that by the time the record becomes clear enough to read in detail, roughly 30 to 40,000 years ago in most of Asia, Denisovans are gone. The populations that carry their genes in the highest concentrations are the populations whose ancestors moved through their territory last, which suggests the Denisovan presence was already fading when Homo sapiens arrived in Southeast Asia and Oceania. What happened to them in the areas of their range where they encountered Homo sapiens earlier? In mainland Asia, across the vast territories they must have occupied between Siberia and the tropics, is a question the physical record cannot currently answer. They are gone. But the child whose finger bones started this whole story is not entirely gone either. If you have ancestry from Papua New Guinea or the Philippines or Aboriginal Australia, somewhere between 4 and 6% of your genome was written by Denisovans. The specific base pairs at thousands of locations in your DNA were determined by the inheritance of a population that science discovered not from their faces or their bones, but from a piece of a child's smallest finger. They are a ghost in the most literal biological sense possible, present in the living without being visible in the dead, still here, in fragments, in the bodies of their descendants, solving problems with solutions they worked out in a world that no longer exists. In 2003, a team of Indonesian and Australian archaeologists working in a limestone cave on the island of Flores in eastern Indonesia found a skeleton that should not have existed. The cave was called Liang Bua, Cool Cave, in the local language. People had been using it for generations as a place to shelter from the tropical heat, and archaeologists had been finding things there for years. Stone tools, animal bones, the ordinary record of human habitation across deep time. Then they found the skeleton. It was in a sediment layer dating to roughly 18,000 years ago, small in a way that took a moment to register properly. The stature, estimated from the long bones, was approximately 1 meter, 100 centimeters, the height of an average 3-year-old in the United States. The brain case was the size of a grapefruit. The researchers considered the possibility that this was a modern human with a developmental condition causing abnormally small brain size. They considered the possibility that it was a child. Despite the evidence of adult dentition, they considered multiple explanations that would have allowed them to fit this skeleton into categories that already existed. None of those explanations held up. What they had found was a fully adult human being, small enough to stand comfortably under the arm of an average modern person, with a brain roughly 1/3 the volume of a modern human brain, living on an island in Indonesia 18,000 years ago, at a time when Homo sapiens had already been living in Australia for more than 30,000 years, had already painted the caves of Lascaux in France, had already spread to nearly every habitable corner of the planet. On Flores, something else entirely was happening. The species was named Homo floresiensis. The media called them hobbits, after the small-statured characters in the Tolkien novels. The name was not scientifically rigorous, but it captured something real about the quality of the discovery, which was that it felt like finding evidence that a world of strange and different people had existed alongside the world we thought we knew. To understand how Homo floresiensis came to be, you have to understand what islands do to evolution. Islands are laboratories, isolated by water, cut off from the genetic exchange that keeps mainland populations standardized. Islands allow evolution to run experiments that would be corrected or averaged out in larger, more connected populations. The most famous of these experiments involves body size, and the pattern is so consistent across so many different species that it has its own name: island dwarfism. On islands with limited food resources and no large predators, large body size becomes a liability. A large body requires more food to maintain. In an environment where food is limited and nothing is large enough to threaten an adult, the energy cost of maintaining a large body outweighs the benefits. Over generations, selection consistently favors smaller individuals, and populations shrink. This has happened with elephants on Mediterranean islands, with hippos on Cyprus, with deer on multiple island systems. It happened with the ancestors of Homo floresiensis on Flores. The ancestor was almost certainly a population closely related to Homo erectus that reached Flores at some point before 800,000 years ago. How they got there is itself a puzzle, because Flores has always been separated from the Asian mainland by deep water channels that did not close even during glacial periods when sea levels dropped dramatically. Crossing those channels required either some form of watercraft or an accidental rafting event, and neither possibility is simple to explain for a population at that technological level. But they got there. The stone tools associated with early occupation of Flores, found in sediment layers dating to roughly 1 million years ago, confirm it, and then, cut off from the mainland and its gene pool, subjected to the island conditions that selection consistently translates into smaller bodies, the population began to change over hundreds of thousands of years. In the patient arithmetic of natural selection, bodies that required less food to sustain left more descendants in an environment where food was the limiting factor. The result, after several 100,000 years, was a population of humans, approximately 1 meter tall, with brains a fraction of the size of their ancestors. What is remarkable is that they were not cognitively simple in proportion to their small brains. They made stone tools with deliberate shapes and worked edges. They hunted stegodon, a prehistoric relative of the elephant that on Flores had also undergone island dwarfism and reached approximately the size of a large water buffalo. Homo floresiensis was hunting animals larger than themselves, using coordinated strategies that required planning and communication. The internal structure of the Homo floresiensis brain, reconstructed through analysis of the skull interior, showed proportionally large regions associated with planning and complex behavior, different from what would be expected from a simple scaling down of a larger brain. Evolution had not just made the brain smaller, it had reorganized it. They survived on Flores until somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Depending on which dating you accept, what ended them is not known with certainty. A large volcanic eruption on Flores around 70,000 years ago may have had an impact. The arrival of Homo sapiens in the region creates a temporal correlation that is hard to ignore. The honest answer is that we do not know. What we know is that they were there for close to 1 million years, on an island that most people have never heard of. A different kind of human lived and hunted and made tools and eventually stopped existing. Now go to the Philippines. Specifically, go to the northeastern coast of Luzon, the largest island in the Philippine archipelago, to a cave called Calao Cave that sits about 25 meters above the Pinakanawan River in Cagayan Province. Local people had known about Calao Cave for generations. In 2007, an archaeologist named Armand Salvador Mijares began excavating one of its chambers and found a single metatarsal, a foot bone, in a layer dating to at least 67,000 years ago. The bone was unusual enough to warrant attention, but not unusual enough, on its own, to resolve into a clear picture. Mijares kept returning. In 2011 and 2015, more fragments came out of the same layer. Teeth, more foot bones, hand bones. By 2019, the team had recovered remains from at least 3 individuals, and the picture those remains formed was strange enough that they published it as a new species. They named it Homo luzonensis. The morphology was unlike anything previously described. The foot bones had curved toe bones more similar to Australopithecus, the ancient upright walking hominins of Africa that preceded the Homo lineage, than to any other Homo species. The teeth were small, smaller than any known Homo species in Southeast Asia, but with a complexity of cusp pattern not found in other groups. The hand bones showed a curvature, suggesting a capacity for tree climbing retained in a population that was otherwise clearly more derived in its characteristics. Homo luzonensis looked, in other words, like evolution had been doing what evolution does on islands, taking a founding population and running it in directions that the mainland version never went, producing a combination of features that made sense in the specific context of Luzon but made no sense in any existing framework built from mainland specimens. The oldest evidence of hominin activity on Luzon goes back at least 700,000 years. The age of cut-marked animal bones found at a separate site on the island. Something was on Luzon for a very long time before Homo luzonensis was the form it took. What that something was, whether it was a Homo erectus population or something else entirely, and how it became the morphologically unusual group that Mijares and his team found in Calao Cave, is a question the current evidence cannot answer. What Homo luzonensis and Homo floresiensis tell us together is something that should fundamentally reshape the picture of human prehistory. The story of human evolution is not primarily a story about Africa and Europe. It is a story about the entire planet, including the islands and archipelagos of Southeast Asia, where species-level diversity in the human family was, by the evidence currently available, higher per square kilometer than anywhere else on Earth. The accidents of preservation, the fact that the moist, tropical environments of island Southeast Asia are hostile to the survival of ancient bone, and the historical patterns of where Western archaeology concentrated its attention for the first century of the discipline's existence, have left this region chronically underrepresented in the human story as it is usually told. What we have found there, in the few sites where conditions allowed preservation, suggests that what we have not found is considerable. Every island in the Philippine and Indonesian archipelagos that was separated from the mainland by deep water channels for long enough is a candidate for having hosted a population that evolved independently. Most of those islands have never been systematically excavated for ancient human remains. Some never will be, because the preservation conditions make recovery of bone from the relevant time periods essentially impossible. Flores gave us Homo floresiensis. Luzon gave us Homo luzonensis. Each discovery came from a single cave, excavated by a small team working with limited resources, finding fragments that could easily have been missed or misidentified. The islands kept their secrets well, but every secret they have given up so far has been a human story that no one knew existed. In October of 2013, a caver named Rick Hunter was squeezing through a passage in the Rising Star cave system outside Johannesburg, South Africa. The passage was so narrow that getting through it required exhaling completely and turning sideways. At its tightest point, it measured less than 18 centimeters wide. He was following a lead passed along by a colleague. Something interesting might be deeper in the system, past the parts already mapped and catalogued. The cave was well known to local cavers. Parts of it had been explored for decades. But the deepest chambers, the ones that required navigating passages that filtered out anyone above a certain shoulder width, had received less attention. What Hunter found on the other side of that passage was a chamber about 30 meters underground, accessible only through the squeeze he had just navigated, with no obvious entrance large enough for an adult human to pass through comfortably. The floor of that chamber was covered in bones. Human bones. Enough of them that the count of individuals eventually reached at least 15, spread across the chamber floor in a distribution that did not look like the random accumulation of animals that had fallen through a crack in the ceiling. There were no signs of predator activity. No evidence of flooding that could have carried the bodies there. No natural process that researchers could point to that would deposit this many individuals in this specific location, in this specific way. It looked like the bones had been placed there. The species those bones belonged to was named Homo naledi, after the Sesotho word for star, a reference to the Rising Star cave system where the remains were found. And from the first detailed analysis of the morphology, it was clear that Homo naledi did not fit any framework that paleoanthropology had built to that point. The hands were nearly human, with long fingers and a thumb capable of the kind of precision grip that tool use requires. The feet were nearly human, shaped for bipedal walking in a way that would have been familiar in any modern human foot. The lower limbs were built for upright locomotion. The skull was not what those hands and feet would have predicted. The brain case of Homo naledi was small, somewhere between 400 and 600 cubic centimeters, roughly 1/3 the volume of a modern human brain, closer in size to Australopithecus than to any member of the genus Homo previously described. Homo naledi looked, from the skull up, like a creature that should have existed 3 million years ago. It looked, from the neck down, like something that had evolved much more recently. Then the dating came back. The initial discovery prompted assumptions that the morphology supported. Homo naledi must be very old, a primitive-looking species in southern Africa, probably from the early Pleistocene, probably a very ancient branch of the human family that had survived in isolation long enough to be found fossilized in an unusual cave deposit. The dating, published in 2017, showed something that forced a comprehensive reassessment. Homo naledi was not from the early Pleistocene. The remains from the Dinaledi chamber dated to somewhere between 235,000 and 336,000 years ago. Not 3 million years old. Not even 1 million years old. Homo naledi, with its small brain and its mosaic of primitive and derived features, was alive in southern Africa, at roughly the same time that the earliest anatomically modern Homo sapiens were appearing elsewhere on the same continent. Two different kinds of human beings, dramatically different in their morphology, separated by what appeared to be hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary divergence, existed on the same continent at roughly the same time. The question of the bones in the chamber remained. 15 individuals, accessible only through passages too narrow for comfortable adult passage, with no evidence of predator activity, no evidence of flooding, no natural process that adequately explains the distribution. The researchers who analyzed the site argued that the most parsimonious explanation was deliberate deposition of the dead, that Homo naledi was bringing its dead into this difficult-to-reach chamber intentionally. This interpretation was contested. It remains contested. The argument against it is straightforward. Deliberate treatment of the dead is a behavior associated with cognitive capabilities that a brain the size of Homo naledi's seems unlikely to support. Based on everything we thought we understood about the relationship between brain size and complex behavior. But Homo floresiensis had already complicated everything we thought we understood about that relationship. And there is additional evidence from a second chamber in the rising star system, the Lesedi chamber, discovered later, where more Homo naledi remains were found, including a nearly complete skull. The pattern of deposition there mirrors the pattern in the Dinaledi chamber in ways that are difficult to explain through random natural processes. The honest position is this: the evidence is striking. The proposed explanation is extraordinary. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the debate continues. What is not contested is that Homo naledi existed, that it existed more recently than its morphology would have predicted, and that its existence in southern Africa during the same broad period as early Homo sapiens raises questions about the complexity of the human story on the continent where our species originated that have not been resolved. Homo naledi is the species in the human family that most clearly demonstrates the degree to which our picture of human evolution is still incomplete. If a species this morphologically unusual could exist in southern Africa during a period when Homo sapiens was already present on the same continent, and remain entirely unknown to science until 2013, then the assumption that the current fossil record gives us a reasonably complete picture of human diversity during this period deserves serious scrutiny. It does not give us a complete picture. It gives us a sample. In the early 1940s, a Chinese laborer was working on the construction of a bridge over the Songhua River in Harbin, in northeastern China. The region was under Japanese occupation. The construction project was Japanese-directed, and somewhere in the course of that work, the laborer found something in the ground that he understood, with whatever instinct a person develops for such things, should not go to the Japanese authorities. It was a skull, large, heavy, old, in a way that was apparent even to someone with no training in paleontology or archaeology. The man wrapped it carefully, carried it away from the construction site, and lowered it into the well on his property. He told no one outside his immediate family. He continued his life. The Japanese occupation ended. Decades passed. The People's Republic of China was established and grew and changed around him. He grew old. He kept the secret until shortly before his death. When he finally told his grandson what was in the well and why it had been put there, his grandson brought the skull to scientists. The researchers who examined it in 2018 were looking at something that had spent more than 70 years in a well, hidden from authorities by a man who made a decision in the middle of an occupied city during wartime and then spent the rest of his life honoring it. Whatever his reasons, whether it was defiance of the occupiers or simple intuition that the thing he had found belonged to his people's history rather than theirs. The result was that a skull, more than 146,000 years old, survived intact, while much of the world around it was being destroyed. The skull was unlike anything previously described, larger than a modern human skull, with a brain case estimated at around 1,420 cubic centimeters, within the range of modern human brain volume, but, at the upper end of it, a broad, flat face, large, nearly square eye sockets that gave the face a quality that one researcher described as simultaneously ancient and somehow immediate, as if the distance between that individual and a modern human was smaller than the anatomy suggested it should be. The combination of features did not match Homo sapiens. It did not match Neanderthals. It did not match Homo erectus. It did not match any previously described species in any database that existed when the skull was finally examined. The researchers who described it proposed a new species name, Homo longi, from the Chinese word for dragon, a reference to the Dragon River near where the skull was found. The proposal was contested, as proposals in paleoanthropology almost always are. Some researchers argued it was more likely a Denisovan, given the geographic location and the time period. Others argued it fell within the known range of variation for Homo heidelbergensis, a broad species designation used for various Middle Pleistocene humans across Europe and Africa. The debate has not been resolved. But the debate itself is the point. The Harbin skull is not an isolated anomaly in East Asian paleoanthropology. It is one entry in a longer list of specimens from China and surrounding regions that resist easy classification. Skulls and jaw fragments and isolated teeth that show combinations of features not found in any single established species. Old enough and distinctive enough to represent separate populations, but impossible to assign confidently to any named group. The skulls from Dali and Jinyushan in China have puzzled researchers for decades with the same quality of stubborn in-betweenness, the same refusal to fit cleanly into the categories built primarily around the European fossil record. What this pattern reflects is something important about the part of the world it comes from. Asia, from the Middle East through Central Asia to the Pacific coast, was a region of extraordinary human diversity during the Middle and Late Pleistocene. The Denisovans alone, whose range stretched from Siberia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, were probably not a single uniform population, a group occupying that range for hundreds of thousands of years, separated by mountain ranges and deserts and thousands of kilometers of varied landscape, would have developed regional variants. Some of those variants may have been distinctive enough in their morphology to have been assigned separate species names if their fossils had been found before the DNA evidence established their relationship to each other. Some of them may already have been found, assigned those separate names, and filed away in museums and research institutions for decades, waiting for the technology that could connect them, the tools available to make those connections, ancient protein analysis and, in rare cases, ancient DNA from specimens preserved in unusual conditions, are only beginning to be applied systematically to the East Asian fossil record. What they will eventually show is genuinely unknown. The honest answer about the Harbin skull, about the Dali skull, about the dozens of fragmentary specimens from across China and Southeast Asia that do not fit comfortably into any existing framework, is that we do not yet know what they are or how many distinct groups they represent. And that honest answer, that the map of human diversity in Asia during the period when Homo sapiens was beginning its own story, is still largely undrawn, is itself one of the most important things this story has to say. The more we find, the less simple the story becomes. And the less simple the story becomes, the more weight falls on the question that the next chapter has to carry. What happened when we arrived? The Neanderthals knew this landscape, not in the way that a tourist knows a city after 3 days of walking its streets, in the way that a people knows a place after 200,000 years of living in it, of burying their dead in it, of learning its seasonal rhythms and its water sources and the specific routes that prey animals took through its valleys when the cold came and the herds moved south. They knew which caves held warmth through the worst winters. They knew where the flint outcrops were, and which ones produced stone that held an edge, and which ones fractured badly and were not worth the effort. They knew the river crossing points. They knew the smell of the air before a storm and the quality of light in late afternoon when the hunting was good. And then, from the south and the east, something new was coming. Homo sapiens had been spreading out of Africa for tens of thousands of years, moving through the Middle East and into Central Asia, following routes that game and water made viable, establishing populations in new territories, and then expanding further from those footholds. By around 45,000 years ago, the leading edge of that expansion was pushing into Europe, into Neanderthal territory. What happened next is the central mystery of human prehistory, and the honest answer is that we do not fully know. We know the broad outlines. Homo sapiens arrived. Neanderthals disappeared. The two events are connected. But the details, what passed between two different kinds of human beings during thousands of years of shared landscape, remain one of the most contested and most incompletely resolved questions in the entire field. Current estimates, based on radiocarbon dating of Neanderthal and early modern human sites across Europe, suggest that the two groups coexisted in Europe for somewhere between 2,600 and 5,400 years. Depending on the sites included and the statistical methods used, some researchers argue for a longer overlap period in specific regions. Thousands of years is a long time. It is longer than the entire span of ancient Egyptian civilization, from the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt to the death of Cleopatra. It is longer than the gap between the fall of Rome and the present day. It is long enough that the idea of two human groups simply never encountering each other, living in complete parallel on the same continent without any meaningful interaction, becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. And the DNA evidence tells us directly that they encountered each other in at least one specific way. People of non-African ancestry today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. The percentage varies by individual and by population, with East Asian populations tending to carry slightly more than European populations. But the signal is present and consistent across every population tested. It got there because Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had children together, children who survived to adulthood and had children of their own, children whose descendants eventually carried that Neanderthal inheritance forward through all subsequent generations to the present day. The interbreeding happened primarily in the Middle East and Western Asia, based on the geographic pattern of Neanderthal ancestry in modern human populations. The groups that carry the most Neanderthal ancestry are those whose ancestors passed through the region where Homo sapiens and Neanderthals first came into contact. Not in the deep ice of northern Europe, but in the relatively milder conditions of the Levant, where both groups overlapped before Homo sapiens pushed further north and west. In 2015, researchers sequencing the genome of a 45,000-year-old Homo sapiens individual from Ust-Ishim in Siberia found that the segments of Neanderthal ancestry in that genome were longer than the segments found in modern humans. When DNA from different sources mixes in a genome, the distinctive segments get broken up over time by the process of recombination that occurs during reproduction. Longer segments mean more recent mixing. The length of the Neanderthal segments in the Ust-Ishim individual indicated that the interbreeding had occurred somewhere between 200 and 300 generations before that individual lived, placing the mixing event at roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, consistent with the initial contact period in Western Asia. By the time Homo sapiens was pushing into Europe, the interbreeding had already occurred. The Neanderthal ancestry was already part of the Homo sapiens genome. What happened in Europe was something else. In a small number of European sites, there is evidence that looks like cultural exchange between the two groups. The Châtel-Perronian industry, a stone tool tradition found primarily in France and northern Spain and dating to the period of overlap, has been attributed by some researchers to Neanderthals, who were adopting elements of the Upper Paleolithic tool technology that Homo sapiens brought into Europe. The tools are more sophisticated than the Mousterian tools that preceded them in Neanderthal sites, and the sites where they are found sometimes include personal ornaments not found in earlier Neanderthal contexts. Whether this represents independent Neanderthal innovation, direct learning from Homo sapiens through observation or interaction, or something in between is debated. But the possibility that Neanderthals, watching what the newcomers were doing, incorporated new techniques into their own practice, is not ruled out by the evidence. And if it is not ruled out, it suggests a level of interaction between the two groups that goes beyond simple coexistence in the same landscape without awareness of each other. Now, consider a child. In November of 1998, a 4-year-old was found buried in a rock shelter in the Lapido Valley in Portugal. The child had been deliberately buried, laid out with the legs extended and the arms at the sides, with a perforated shell and red ochre pigment associated with the burial. The burial context and the radiocarbon dates placed the child at approximately 24,500 years ago, roughly 15,000 years after the last Neanderthals are believed to have disappeared. The morphology of the skeleton showed something unexpected. The child had the chin and the general cranial form of a modern human, but the limb proportions, the relatively short lower legs and the robust build of the long bones, were more consistent with Neanderthal body proportions than with Homo sapiens children from the same general time period in Europe. The researchers who analyzed the skeleton argued that the most straightforward interpretation was that this was a child of mixed ancestry, a descendant of the interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals that the genetic evidence has since confirmed occurred. Not a first-generation hybrid, but an individual in whom enough Neanderthal ancestry had accumulated or been retained through genetic drift in a small population to produce a visible morphological signal thousands of years after the last Neanderthals were gone. The interpretation was contested, as interpretations of single specimens in paleoanthropology always are. The debate has not been fully resolved, but consider what that child represents, regardless of the outcome of the taxonomic debate. A 4-year-old, buried carefully in a rock shelter in Portugal 24,500 years ago, buried with ochre on the body and a shell, buried by people who cared enough about this specific child to mark the burial with objects of apparent symbolic significance, buried in a way that, when the skeleton was finally found 50,000 years later by a researcher who was looking for something else entirely, told a story about a family and a community and a life that ended too early. Whether that child carried Neanderthal ancestry or not, whether the limb proportions, reflect ancient admixture or individual variation. The burial itself is a document. It documents that 24,500 years ago, in the westernmost edge of Europe, people were doing what people do, marking the deaths of their children with ritual, with objects, with care. The same things that the Neanderthals in the caves to the east and tens of thousands of years earlier had done for their own dead. The 40,000-year overlap is not a clean story. It does not resolve into a simple account of what happened when two human species met. It resolves into a picture of complexity, of contact and exchange and interbreeding and competition and probably conflict and eventually, for one of the two groups, disappearance. What drove that disappearance is the question the next chapter has to answer. But before it does, sit with the image of that valley in Portugal for one more moment. A child, buried with a shell and red pigment. Parents who placed those objects on the body of someone they loved. In a world where the last Neanderthal was already gone, but where something of the Neanderthal world was perhaps still present in the bones of the child they were saying goodbye to. The overlap between us and them was not only a matter of shared geography, it was, in at least some cases, a matter of shared family. There is a gene in the human genome called EPAS1. You have it, almost certainly, unless you are reading this with ancestry from the Tibetan Plateau or a handful of other high-altitude populations. Your version of EPAS1 functions the way it functions in most modern humans, regulating the body's production of red blood cells in response to low oxygen conditions in a way that works adequately at sea level and begins to cause problems at sustained high altitude. Tibetans have a different version. Their version of EPAS1 does not trigger the same overproduction of red blood cells at altitude that causes the thickening of the blood and the increased risk of stroke and heart disease that makes permanent, high-altitude living physiologically dangerous for most human populations. Their version allows the body to function efficiently in thin air, without the compensatory mechanisms that, in other populations, create their own serious health problems. It is one of the most dramatic and well-documented examples of recent natural selection in the human genome. The variant came from Denisovans. We covered that story in Chapter 4, but it belongs here as well. At the opening of this chapter, because it frames the question this chapter is asking in the most concrete way possible. The other humans left things inside us. Functional things. Currently operating things. Things that do real work in real bodies today. Things that those bodies could not do as well without the inheritance of people who are otherwise gone. The Denisovan EPAS1 variant is the clearest example. But it is the Neanderthals who left the broader and more varied biological inheritance in the largest number of living people. And it is their legacy that this chapter turns toward. People of non-African ancestry carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. In a genome of 3 billion base pairs, 1% is 30 million base pairs. 30 million specific locations in your DNA where the sequence was determined by the inheritance of people who had been evolving separately from your other ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. Those locations are not inert. They are not museum pieces sitting in your genome without function. Some of them are doing things right now, in your body, in ways that connect you directly to a world that ended 40,000 years ago. The immune system benefits are the most clearly documented. Certain variants in the toll-like receptor genes, which form part of the innate immune system, the part of immunity that responds immediately to pathogens without requiring prior exposure, show Neanderthal ancestry in modern populations from Eurasia at levels above what would be expected from random genetic drift. Selection kept those variants because they worked. Because recognizing specific pathogens faster gave the immune systems carrying them an edge in environments where those pathogens were present. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for 200,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived. They had encountered and developed partial resistance to the diseases specific to those regions across that entire span of time. When Homo sapiens arrived and interbreeding occurred, they were not just exchanging genes randomly. In some cases, they were acquiring adaptive solutions to regional problems that their own lineage had not yet had time to develop. The newcomers were learning from the residents in a way that had nothing to do with conscious instruction, a way that operated entirely through the unintentional mechanism of reproduction and selection. And then there are the genes that did not confer advantages. Because not everything that came from Neanderthals into the modern human genome was beneficial. Variants linked to susceptibility to depression and seasonal affective disorder in modern populations trace partly to Neanderthal ancestry. Blood-clotting variants with Neanderthal origin increase the risk of certain cardiovascular problems. Immune variants that provided protection against one class of pathogens may have increased susceptibility to others. Neanderthal biology was shaped by selection in a specific environment. Cold European and Western Asian landscapes, over several 100,000 years. When those biological solutions were introduced into modern human genomes, and those genomes began living in different environments, across different climates, encountering different disease pressures, some of the Neanderthal-derived variants that had been useful in their original context became neutral or mildly detrimental in the new one. The body you inhabit today is partly a product of evolutionary compromises made in environments that no longer exist, by people whose world ended somewhere around 40,000 years ago. Now step back from the genetics and return to the question of how that world ended. The Neanderthal population at its peak was never large by modern standards. Genetic analyses of Neanderthal DNA suggest that the effective population size across their entire range was probably in the tens of thousands at most, spread across Europe and Western Asia, organized into small, semi-isolated groups that exchanged individuals occasionally but were not connected into a single integrated population. Small populations are fragile in specific ways. They are more susceptible to the effects of inbreeding, which reduces genetic diversity and can bring harmful, recessive variants together in ways that larger, more outbred populations avoid. The Neanderthal genome shows evidence of significant inbreeding at the population level, with individual genomes showing higher rates of runs of homozygosity than modern human genomes from comparable time periods. This is not a sign of failure. It is a simple consequence of small population size over extended periods. But it has real biological consequences. Small populations are also more susceptible to demographic stochasticity, the random variation in births and deaths that in large populations averages out to predictable trends, but in small populations can push a group toward extinction through bad luck alone. A local group of 30 or 40 individuals needs only a few bad winters, a few disease outbreaks, a few years of poor prey availability to lose enough members that recovery becomes difficult. Homo sapiens arriving in Europe brought pressure across all of these vulnerabilities simultaneously. They brought larger, more connected social networks, exchange systems so geographically extensive that stone and shell and symbolic objects traveled hundreds of miles from their sources, a degree of connectivity that allowed information and resources to flow across distances that Neanderthal populations did not typically maintain. They brought symbolic communication at a scale and complexity that the Neanderthal record does not clearly match. A way of storing and transmitting knowledge that did not depend on direct observation or immediate presence. That allowed coordination among people who had never met and might never meet. They brought a pathogen load shaped by tens of thousands of years of living in African and Middle Eastern environments, encountering domestic and semi-domestic animals, living in larger and more densely connected populations than Neanderthals typically occupied. Some of those pathogens, encountering Neanderthal immune systems that had not co-evolved with them, could have caused mortality rates dramatically higher than the same pathogens caused in the Homo sapiens populations carrying them. None of this required intent. No individual Homo sapiens decided to outcompete the Neanderthals, or even noticed that the Neanderthal populations near them were in decline. The pressures were systemic, operating at the level of populations across centuries and millennia, not at the level of individuals in any single encounter. But the result was the same. Valley by valley, the Neanderthal range contracted. The sites that show evidence of Neanderthal occupation in Central and Eastern Europe disappear from the record first, earlier than sites in Western Europe. The retreat was westward, toward the Atlantic, toward the regions where Homo sapiens was arriving last. The final confirmed Neanderthal sites are clustered in southern Spain and Portugal, at the western edge of the continent, as far as it was possible to go while remaining in Europe. And then those sites go dark too. What the last Neanderthal populations looked like in those final years in the caves above the Atlantic coast of Iberia is something the archaeological record gives only the faintest sense of. Small groups, limited genetic diversity, cut off from contact with other Neanderthal populations by the expansion of Homo sapiens across the intervening territory. But they were still making tools, still hunting, still, by every measure the record allows, living. There is one more detail in the genetics that deserves attention before this story moves to its final question. The 1 to 4% of Neanderthal ancestry in modern human genomes is not uniformly distributed across all parts of the genome. There are regions where Neanderthal ancestry is found at consistently lower levels than expected. Regions that appear to have been selected against in the generations following the initial interbreeding. These regions are associated with male fertility, with immune system function, and with brain development. What this pattern suggests is that some of the genetic combinations produced by Neanderthal Homo sapiens interbreeding were not neutral. Some of them were costly in ways that selection eliminated over time. The hybrids who carried these combinations were less reproductively successful than those who did not. And over generations, the harmful combinations were weeded out, while the beneficial or neutral ones persisted. They were different enough for it to matter, and yet similar enough that the interbreeding occurred. That viable offspring resulted, that those offspring had descendants, that those descendants are alive today. The boundary between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals was real, and it was permeable, and the complexity of that combination, different enough to matter, similar enough to cross, is a better description of the relationship between the two groups than any simple narrative of replacement or conquest or peaceful assimilation can capture. They were not us. They were not entirely separate from us either. They were something in between those categories, in a space that human language does not have a clean word for, because human language was built to describe a world in which only one kind of human exists. The world in which only one kind of human existed is the world we built after they were gone, and how we came to be the only ones. How the full weight of that strangeness came to rest on a single species that had previously shared the planet with at least 8 others, is the question that the next chapter of this story carries. You have been waiting for this chapter. If you have followed this story from the finger bone in the cold open to the last Neanderthals in the caves above the Atlantic. You have been accumulating a question with increasing weight. The question is not complicated to state. It is extremely complicated to answer. Did we kill them? The short answer is probably not in the way the question implies. The long answer is everything that follows. Start with what we know for certain, which is less than the confident tone of most popular accounts of human prehistory would suggest. We know that Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa and across the globe beginning roughly 70,000 years ago. We know that in every region where Homo sapiens expanded, the archaic human populations that had previously occupied those regions subsequently disappeared. We know that the timing of these disappearances correlates with the arrival of Homo sapiens with a consistency that cannot be coincidental. In Europe, Neanderthals disappear after Homo sapiens arrives. In Southeast Asia, Homo floresiensis disappears after Homo sapiens arrives in the region. In Eastern Asia, the archaic populations that populated the continent for hundreds of thousands of years are gone from the record by the time the archaeological record becomes detailed enough to read. The correlation is real and it is global. Correlation is not causation. But when a correlation is global, when it repeats across different species in different environments on different continents over an extended time period, the bar for explaining it as coincidence rises considerably. Something about the expansion of Homo sapiens was bad for other human species. The question is what? Exactly. And the answer, the honest answer that the current evidence supports, is that different things happened in different places, to different groups, through different combinations of pressure, over different timescales. This is what scientists working on the question call an extinction mosaic, a pattern of local disappearances, each with its own specific history, adding up to a global outcome. Consider the differences between the cases. Neanderthals disappeared from a landscape they had occupied for 200,000 years, over a period of thousands of years, in the presence of a competing human group with overlapping resource requirements, larger social networks, and a pathogen load their immune systems had not encountered. The evidence suggests a gradual decline, a contraction of range, a series of local extinctions that worked westward across Europe as Homo sapiens expanded from the east. Homo floresiensis disappeared from an island where they had lived for close to 1 million years, in a much smaller geographic area, with far less room to retreat as pressures on their population increased. Island species are more vulnerable to extinction than mainland species for exactly this reason. There is no adjacent territory to move into when conditions in the home territory deteriorate. The combination of a small island, a small and probably already inbred population, a volcanic landscape capable of catastrophic disruption, and the arrival of a competing human group represents a convergence of pressures that a population of perhaps a few hundred individuals was not equipped to survive indefinitely. Denisovans disappeared from a range that stretched across the largest continent on Earth, but their populations were probably small and isolated across that range, adapted to local conditions in ways that made them effective in specific environments, but potentially vulnerable to the disruption of those environments by climate change or by competition with a more connected, more widely ranging competitor. The Denisovan populations that survived the longest, based on the geographic pattern of their ancestry in modern humans, were the ones in the most isolated and geographically extreme environments. The high-altitude populations, whose biology made them effective in conditions that Homo sapiens could not easily occupy. In each case, the specific combination of factors that drove the local population toward extinction was different. The outcome was the same. Now add the factor that the genetics have made impossible to ignore: interbreeding. The genomes of modern humans contain Neanderthal ancestry. They contain Denisovan ancestry. They contain signals of ancestry from at least one other archaic group that has not yet been identified from physical remains. The interbreeding was not rare or accidental. It was sustained enough to leave a consistent and measurable genetic signal in the descendants of those contact events. What this means for the extinction question is complex. In one sense, the other humans did not go extinct. Parts of them survived, incorporated into the Homo sapiens gene pool, carried forward in the genomes of descendants who identified as Homo sapiens, who were culturally and socially Homo sapiens, but who carried a biological inheritance from the other groups. If extinction means the complete disappearance of every piece of a lineage from the world, then the Neanderthals and the Denisovans did not go extinct. They were partially absorbed. In another sense, absorption is still a form of ending. The Neanderthals, as a distinct group, with their own culture and their own technology and their own social organization and their own way of being human in the world, are gone. The fragments of their biology that survived in modern human genomes do not constitute the continuation of Neanderthal culture or Neanderthal society or any of the things that made Neanderthals Neanderthals, rather than simply a source of genetic material. A people is not only their DNA. The extinction of the Neanderthals as a people, as a distinct form of human experience in the world, happened regardless of the percentage of their genome that persisted in the populations that replaced them. Now look at the broader pattern. Homo sapiens had something that the other human groups did not have, or did not have to the same degree. And that something was decisive in the long run, even if it was not decisive in any individual encounter. The leading candidates are interconnected in ways that make them difficult to rank cleanly. The first is network size. The exchange networks of Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens were larger, more complex, and more geographically extensive than those of any other human group. The evidence is in the raw materials at Homo sapiens sites, objects that traveled hundreds of miles from their sources, indicating connections between groups across distances that Neanderthal exchange patterns did not typically match. Larger networks mean more information, more genetic diversity, more resilience, and more ability to recover from local catastrophes by drawing on resources and connections from beyond the affected area. The second is symbolic communication, the explosion of art, personal ornamentation, and long-distance exchange of symbolically significant objects in the Upper Paleolithic record is not matched in the records of other contemporary human groups. Symbolic communication allows information to be stored and transmitted in ways that do not depend on direct observation or immediate presence. It allows the accumulated knowledge of many individuals across many generations to be preserved in forms that can be accessed by people who were not present when the knowledge was generated. It allows coordination among people who have never met, through shared symbols and shared stories that create a common framework for behavior. The third is demographic density. Even at low population densities by modern standards, Homo sapiens populations in Europe and Asia were probably larger in total than the Neanderthal or Denisovan populations they were replacing. Larger populations generate more random variation, more opportunities for useful mutations to arise, more raw material for selection to work with. They also generate more pressure on shared resources in ways that consistently disadvantage smaller populations. None of these advantages required Homo sapiens to be conscious of them. No individual Homo sapiens decided to outcompete the Neanderthals by building better exchange networks or developing more sophisticated symbolic communication. These were properties of the group. not intentions of individuals. And they operated at the population level over timescales that no individual could perceive. The Neanderthal, who was a better stone napper than the Homo sapiens living in the next valley, was not losing to the Homo sapiens because of anything the Homo sapiens did better in that specific encounter. The Neanderthal population that was declining across Europe was not declining because of any single event or any single interaction. It was declining because the systemic properties of the Homo sapiens expansion were, on the whole and over the long run, not compatible with the continued existence of a separate, smaller, less connected human group occupying the same resources. There is one more element that needs to be addressed directly, because it sits at the edge of the question in a way that makes comfortable answers impossible. Some of it was probably violent. The archaeological record of the contact period in Europe includes evidence that is difficult to interpret as anything other than violence between human groups. Cut marks on human bones. Sites where skeletal remains show evidence of trauma inconsistent with accident. Human groups throughout history have responded to competition over resources with violence. There is no reason to assume the archaic period was different. The specific scale and nature of that violence, whether it was organized, whether it was systematic, whether it represented anything like the purposeful elimination of a competing group, or simply the ordinary background level of intergroup conflict that characterized most of human prehistory, cannot be determined from the current evidence. But the disappearance of the Neanderthals was not peaceful in any straightforward sense. It was the end of a people in a landscape being reorganized by the arrival of a competing group that had advantages the Neanderthals did not. That was expanding while the Neanderthals were contracting. That was filling the territory. The Neanderthals were vacating before the Neanderthals had finished vacating it. The extinction mosaic does not resolve into a simple verdict. It resolves into a picture of complexity that is, in the end, more honest than any simple verdict could be. The other humans disappeared for many reasons. In many ways, over many thousands of years. In a process that was never clean and never complete, and that left traces of the departed in the biology of the survivors that are still visible today. The honest answer to the question of whether we killed them is something like this. We arrived, and they disappeared. And the connection between those two facts is real and causal, and not reducible to any single mechanism. We outcompeted some of them. We absorbed parts of others. We spread diseases that hit populations with no prior exposure harder than they hit us. We may have killed some of them directly, in individual encounters, and possibly in something that deserves to be called conflict. We occupied their territories as they vacated them, and then continued expanding into the territories they still held. We were there when it happened. We were the variable that changed. And when the process was complete, when the last of the others was gone and the human world had narrowed to a single species, something had been lost that had existed for millions of years and would never exist again. The other humans themselves. And the world in which being human meant more than one thing. Go outside tonight. It does not matter where you are. A city, or a suburb, or a stretch of rural road with nothing visible for miles in any direction. Step outside and look at the sky, and then look at the ground, and then look at whatever is around you. The trees, or the buildings, or the empty fields. And try to hold a single fact in your mind long enough for it to become real, rather than just a sentence you read. You are the only kind of human being on this planet. Not the only person. Not the only member of your community, or your country, or your species in the biological sense. The only kind. The only form that the word human currently takes in the world. Every person alive right now. Every one of the 8 billion human beings currently occupying this planet belongs to a single group, Homo sapiens, the sole surviving branch of a family that once had at least 8 other members. That fact is so familiar that it has stopped feeling like a fact. It feels like a condition of existence, like the presence of gravity or the alternation of day and night. Something that was always true and will always be true and does not require examination, because it is simply the background against which everything else happens. It is not a condition of existence. It is a recent development. 40,000 years ago, there were others, not in some distant corner of the world that no human being had yet reached. In Europe, in Asia, on islands in the Pacific, in the caves and valleys and high plateaus that were home to human groups who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years before any Homo sapiens arrived to share the landscape with them. 40,000 years is not very long. It is roughly the time separating the oldest cave paintings at Lascaux from the moment you are reading these words. It is less than 2,000 human generations. It is a span of time that feels ancient by the standards of human civilization, which measures its oldest cities in thousands of years and its oldest writing in a few thousand more. But by the standards of the evolutionary and geological timescales that this story has been working in, 40,000 years is not ancient. It is practically this morning. For most of the time that something recognizable as a human being has existed on this planet, the human world was not a world of one. It was a world of several, of many, of a diversity of human forms spread across a planet large enough and varied enough to sustain them, different in their bodies and their ecologies and their specific solutions to the common problems of being a large-brained, bipedal, tool-using animal in a world that did not particularly care whether any of them survived. That diversity is gone, and we are so accustomed to its absence that most of us have never thought of it as an absence at all. Consider what it would mean if it were not gone. If the last 10,000 years had unfolded differently, if Homo sapiens had expanded more slowly, or the other groups had been more resilient, or the specific combination of pressures that drove the others toward extinction had been slightly less complete in its work, the world today might contain more than one kind of human being, not the world of 50,000 years ago, with 8 or 9 distinct groups scattered across the planet, but a world with 2 or 3 different human lineages still present, still distinct, still representing different experiments in the problem of how to be human. What would that world look like? The question cannot be answered, because the world it imagines does not exist, and the variables are too complex and too contingent for any reliable projection. But the asking of it reveals something important about the world we actually have. The world we actually have is one in which a single lineage of humans has taken every viable habitat on the planet and filled it, and in the process of filling it, has constructed civilizations and technologies and cultural systems of extraordinary complexity and diversity. The diversity we have produced within our single lineage is real. The range of human cultures and languages and ways of organizing a life that Homo sapiens has generated in 40,000 years of sole occupancy of the planet is genuinely remarkable. But it is diversity within a single genetic and cognitive framework. Variation on a single theme. The kind of diversity that a single species can generate when it occupies many different environments. Not the kind of diversity that exists when multiple species, shaped by different evolutionary histories spanning hundreds of thousands of years, inhabit the same world simultaneously. We are diverse. We are not as diverse as we were. The loneliness that this story points toward is not the loneliness of isolation within a social world. It is something older and stranger than that. It is the loneliness of being the last member of a family that was once large. The loneliness of a world in which the word human has only one referent. When for most of human history, it would have needed several. Most people do not experience this as loneliness, because most people do not think about it at all. The absence of the others is not visible in daily life. There are no empty chairs. There are no spaces on the landscape marked for the use of a group that no longer exists. The Neanderthal valleys and the Denisovan highlands and the small dark island where Homo floresiensis hunted dwarf elephants with stone tools are now occupied by people who belong to our lineage, who have built their lives there without any awareness that the land was already known before they arrived. The absence is invisible because we filled it so completely, but it is there, in the place where 8 other human stories should be continuing and are not, in the silence where other ways of being human should be audible and have not been heard for 40,000 years. Now go back to the finger bone, the small fragment from the pinky finger of a child, pulled from the sediment of Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Small enough to hold between 2 fingers, old enough that the child it belonged to had been dead for somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years before anyone found the bone. And the bone had spent all that time waiting in the cold, dark of a cave that had been used as shelter by several different kinds of human beings across deep time. That bone is in a laboratory in Leipzig now. The child it came from belonged to a group of human beings that occupied a range stretching from the cold mountains of Siberia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, a range larger than the modern United States and Europe combined. For hundreds of thousands of years, they adapted to high altitude in ways that their descendants, living today on the Tibetan Plateau, still benefit from. They left their genetic mark on populations across the breadth of Asia and into the Pacific. They were, by every measure available, a successful and widespread and biologically sophisticated group of human beings. We know them almost entirely from that finger bone and a few teeth and a jaw fragment found on a plateau in China and the DNA they left behind in the people who carry their inheritance today. That is what we have. From hundreds of thousands of years of a human presence across an entire continent. That is the physical record that survives. Think about that proportion. Hundreds of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of individual lives. Each one lived in full, with its own specific experiences of cold and warmth, of hunger and satisfaction, of the particular quality of light in the specific valley where that individual spent most of their existence, of the faces of the people they knew, of whatever it felt like to be the kind of human being they were. Hundreds of thousands of lives. And what the physical record preserves is a finger bone and a few teeth. The rest is gone. Gone in the sense that truly matters, which is not lost or misplaced or waiting to be found with sufficient effort. Gone in the sense of truly absent, dissolved by time and chemistry and the indifference of geological process, reduced to nothing that any instrument can detect. The lived experience of the Denisovans, whatever it felt like to be them, whatever they understood about the world they inhabited, whatever they valued and feared and worked toward, is inaccessible to us in any direct way and will remain so. The same is true of the Neanderthals. The same is true of Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi and Homo luzonensis and Homo erectus in all the populations and all the valleys and all the 10,000 years of daily life that accumulated across 2 million years of their existence on this planet. We have fragments. We have chemistry. We have the compressed and fossilized residue of lives that were fully lived, interpreted by scientists, working backward from evidence that gets thinner and more ambiguous the further back they reach. We do not have the people, and yet, in a way that is not metaphorical and is not romantic, but is simply biological fact, we are not entirely without them. If your lineage traces back to Europe or Asia or the Americas or the Pacific Islands, some percentage of your genome, small but real, was written by people who are no longer here as a distinct group. The specific number varies. 1%, 2%, 4%, depending on your ancestry and the specific archaic groups your ancestors encountered. In a genome of 3 billion base pairs, 1% is 30 million specific locations where the sequence was determined by the inheritance of people who had been separate from your other ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. Those locations are not inert. Some of them are helping your immune system recognize pathogens that your purely Homo sapiens ancestors had not encountered. Some of them, in high-altitude populations, are allowing bodies to function in conditions that would cause serious problems without the specific adaptation that came from archaic ancestry. The others are gone, and they are still here. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the tension between them does not resolve into something clean and comfortable. They are gone in the sense that matters most, which is that they no longer exist as distinct peoples, with their own cultures and their own ways of understanding the world and their own experience of what it is to be human. They are still here in the sense that some of what they built over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution was incorporated into the lineage that replaced them and continues to function in the bodies of that lineage's descendants. It is a strange kind of survival, the least personal kind imaginable. Biology, doing what biology does, which is to carry forward whatever works without any awareness of what it is carrying or where it came from. The Denisovan child whose finger bone started this story did not know that tens of thousands of years after her death, her DNA would help a researcher in Leipzig understand that an entirely unknown branch of the human family had existed. She did not know that her genome would help scientists understand how human populations had moved across Asia in deep prehistory. She did not know that the specific version of EPAS, one that her lineage had developed, would still be doing useful work in the bodies of people living on the Tibetan plateau in the 21st century. She was just a child who lived and died in a cave in Siberia. In a world where the human family was still large enough to include people she had never met and would never meet, living their own full and specific lives in places she would never see. That world is gone. What replaced it is everything we have built in the 40,000 years since. Cities and languages and legal systems and the internet and space telescopes and the full extraordinary catalogue of what a single lineage of human beings can produce when it has an entire planet to itself and enough time to figure out what to do with it. It is a remarkable inheritance. It is also, in a way that becomes visible only when you look at the full scope of the story, a lonely one. We are the last human species. We have been alone for 40,000 years, and in all of that time, the size of what we lost has been sitting quietly in the fossil record and in our own genomes, waiting for us to develop the tools to read it and the willingness to understand what it says. We were not always this alone. We were not always the only kind. And whatever it means to be human, whatever that word is really pointing at when we use it, it pointed at more than one thing for most of the time it has existed. It points at only one thing now. And that, in the end, may be the strangest fact in the entire strange story of how the human world came to be, the world we inhabit today. We barely noticed losing them. We built everything we have in the silence they left behind. And almost none of us have ever stopped to wonder what that silence actually is, or how long it has been there, or what a world that still contained the others would have sounded like compared to the one we have. Go back outside. Look at the sky. Listen to whatever is around you. What you are hearing is a world with only one kind of human in it. A world where every voice, and every language, and every song, and every argument, and every prayer is coming from the same single branch of a family that was once large and various and spread across this planet in forms that we are only beginning to understand. It has been this way for 40,000 years. It feels permanent because it is all we have ever known. It is not permanent. It is not ancient. It is not the natural condition of a planet that for most of its human history held several kinds of people at once. It is just what is left. The last chapter of a story that started almost 2 million years ago with a creature standing at the edge of a lake in Kenya, looking at the horizon, deciding to find out what was on the other side. All the other chapters are closed. We are writing the final one, and we are the only ones left to do it.